I am Sandra Coburn, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Cloudburst Group, who is representing USAID E3 Land with this broadcast. I wanted to let you know that you have a couple of options for submitting your questions because we want to keep this dialogue interesting. So you can scroll down below the video screen that you're watching right now, and you'll see a form where you can send questions to us. You can also send questions to us via Twitter using the hashtag #LandInConflict, and we will be live tweeting this broadcast from the handle @USAIDEnviro. And with that, I'll hand it over to our wonderful moderator, Kim Thompson.
Hi, thank you, Sandra, and welcome again to the Land in Conflict webinar. My name is Kim Thompson. I'm a natural resources and conflict specialist at USAID in Washington. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today for what I know is going to be a rich discussion on how development programs can address grievances over land in conflict, post-conflict, or fragile states. And I'd also like to thank the Land and Urban Office as well as Cloudburst for allowing this webinar, making this webinar possible. First order of business, just a few notes on how this webinar is going to run. First, we will hear from all the panelists. Then I will ask a number of questions and we'll get some debate going. And then towards the end of the webinar is when we'll start addressing comments that are coming in online. But please feel free to enter your comments at any time and we'll address them towards the end of the webinar. Again, I'm very excited to be here. This is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. I recently served in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where issues over land in a conflict environment is really critical. And from that experience, I wanted to highlight a few, particularly the issue of displacement, both as a cause and a consequence of conflict. DRC, there's displacement caused by armed group activities, which displaces communities. You have large-scale mining concessions, which are given out by the central government, which again displaces people from agricultural lands. You also have one of the key that a lot of people, that is really critical to people's livelihoods is artisanal mining. Artisanal miners tend to be transitory in nature, and this is actually happens on quite a large scale. A particular mine site can go from having 2 or 3 miners on the ground to a couple of thousand in a matter of weeks or months. And again, that has really big consequences for populations. And all this is to say that in a country, in a conflict setting, there are often a huge number of internally displaced people and a lot of competing claims over land that can and often do erupt into violent conflict, restarting that cycle of violence. And it raises really complex questions about who really owns the land. You know, is there a neutral arbiter to look at competing land claims? How do we balance the needs of returning populations against the needs of people who are currently inhabiting that land? There are historical and temporal dimensions. And this is why we are here today, to discuss some of these really complex issues. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of the countries in which we work are either conflict affected or fragile, which means that if we are programming in sectors that deal with land, that we really have a duty to understand how those interventions will either mitigate or contribute to conflict. Firstly, if we're primarily concerned about reducing conflict, then we also have a duty to understand how these local level grievances over land can trigger larger scale conflicts. And you know, land is a critical economic asset. It's a critical source of livelihood, but more than that, it's often tied to more nebulous concepts such as identity or ethnic identity or religious identity, and making small-scale conflicts erupt into larger scale political grievances. And that is why we are here today, and that's why we have set up a panel of experts to talk about how people are dealing with these really complex issues on the ground through research or by implementing programs. And so I would like to introduce the panelists that we will have with us today, and then pass it over to them to do an introduction of what they're going to be talking about today. We have with us today Dr. John Unruh, who is the Associate Professor at McGill University, and Anna Knox, who's the Chief of Party in USAID Colombia's program on land and rural development. And then perhaps later today, maybe joining late, we're not sure yet, there were some technical issues, Dr. Zemin Hadis, Senior Agricultural Policy Advisor from USAID Ethiopia. I'd like to pass it over to John to do a quick introduction.
Thank you, Kim. As Kim mentioned, I'm John Unruh with McGill University in Montreal. I look at the policy and the practice aspects of war-affected states with regard to housing, land, and property. Currently, we have a project that encompasses both Iraq and Syria and looks at the use of digital media for refugees and the internally displaced to begin to assemble their evidence for claiming or reclaiming their housing, land, and property rights when they're able to return. Today, I'll focus on Iraq, where the primary issue is the imminent return of about 3.3 million people to areas that have recently been retaken from ISIL. So here we see a large need for awareness raising and a large need for the returnees to understand what forms of evidence are acceptable, what forms of evidence they're going to need in order to adequately reclaim their property from others who may have purchased it from ISIL, others who may be occupying because there's nowhere else to go, or what the remedies are for damage or destroyed housing, land, and property. So we look at what the internally displaced in Iraq are already doing in terms of how they use digital media. What do they recognize as evidence? Are they aware of concepts such as corroboration, et cetera? Ideally, we would like everyone to have a document, a title, et cetera, to their property. That's usually not the case, particularly when we have this large surge of fraudulent titles that always emerge during war. So the ultimate point then of having evidence uploaded during the conflict is that then it's a very quick use in exercises such as mass claims for housing, land, and property restitution after the war. And I'll end there.
Great, thank you. Anna, can you introduce yourself as well? Hey, Anna, we can't hear you. I think, can you try to unmute your microphone?
Okay, sorry, I think I unmuted and then remuted. Okay, good morning. As Kim mentioned, I'm the Chief of Party for the USAID Land and Rural Development Program in Colombia. I've had a fairly dedicated career to land and land issues since graduate school, actually, for quite a while, and more recently, prior to coming on board with the Land and Rural Development Program, or LRDP, in Colombia. I worked for 4 years in Rwanda as a Chief of Party on a land program there. So a little bit of background on what the LRDP, or Land and Rural Development Program. It's a 5-year program. We're entering the 5th and final year of that program now. So we're really in a heavy implementation phase, but also seeing a lot of the results from the programming. A critical goal, as we are in a sort of a conflict and also post-conflict phase in Colombia is developing or creating conditions and supporting particularly the government of Colombia in creating conditions for enduring peace throughout the countryside and also more broadly in the country itself. And doing that with identifying important ways to address land and land interventions. Land was one of the key critical factors contributing to conflict, and also that erupted during the process of conflict, such as what Kim talked about too, with massive displacement. The program focuses on 4 primary and very integrated components: land restitution and supporting the government of Colombia in restituting people who were displaced back to their land. Also, formalization of land rights to ensure people have legal or state backing to their rights, and those are recognized. Also, rural development, and that's a really important component of the program to reinforce and support the land work, and also an information technology component, which really cuts across all of those and supports land restitution, supports land formalization, supports the rural development program to create more efficient public service delivery. So our work is really with the government of Colombia, both at local levels and at national levels, to do better public service delivered and more efficient public service delivery on land, things ranging from land administration to public infrastructure and rural development activities. We work in 5 regions: Meta, and, all rural areas; Meta, Northern Cesar, Northern Cauca, south of Tolima, and the Montes de Maria region. And I think important to note, many of the audience will know that Colombia has endured a conflict that has lasted for over half a century. And at this point, just late last year, there was a signing of the peace agreement with the largest guerrilla organization involved in that conflict, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. And now we're in the process of, government is in the process of implementing that peace agreement. So LRDP contributes a lot to the process of the implementation process, and some of the key aspects in that agreement which focus on land and rural development.
Great, thank you for those introductions. It's one thing that I noticed from both of those is this issue of restitution clearly is coming to the forefront, as well as using information technology, which is quite interesting. So just to start out, I'd like to ask both of you, that there are, in post-conflict environments, there are a lot of competing claims. There's a lot of needs, not competing claims over land, but there's a lot of competing priorities in terms of development projects. Why, in your opinion, should we be focused on issues of land, list of development challenges? And either one of you can feel free to take the first shot at that.
I don't want to compete with you, John. Would you like me to go first here? Okay. Well, particularly when I'm going to focus mostly on Colombia and on in the case of conflict, and why land is so important to focus on in when we're looking at a post-conflict or diminishing conflict environment. One, in the case of Colombia, one of the key roots of the conflict is social inequality, and which was certainly reinforced a lot by the severe inequities in the distribution of land, and that fuels a lot of social grievances, and a lot of the conflict emerged particularly in rural areas where that very inequitable distribution of land is taking place. So if, of course, you don't deal with the roots of the conflict, resolving that conflict in a durable way, it can be very challenging. And I think Colombia is still really struggling with that. There continues to be very inequitable distribution of land. In many ways, that was actually exacerbated by the conflict because of the massive displacement. It created the opportunities for powerful interests to accumulate land. And then with the entry of the drug trade as well, it makes land even more attractive because it's very lucrative asset, not only for growth of illicit crops, but for those criminal interests to accumulate land also for illicit crops or illicit activities as well, to in many ways launder their money or different things. So it was a conflict sparked by inequity, but then also during the process of the conflict, actually greater inequities evolved. So the peace agreement now is, one of the key aspects of that is to focus on how do we improve the distribution of land through the creation of a land fund. It calls for the creation of 3 million hectares, 3 million hectares of land for redistribution, and also subsidies and credit access for those who are landless or are very land poor to be able to acquire and get access to land. Another aspect I think that is crucial as well, of course, is massive displacement and restitution. Colombia has an extraordinary number of people who are displaced by the conflict, estimated around 7 million. I think it's only second perhaps to Syria. And then restitution is highly important in land, not only for helping redress social inequalities, but of course creating a climate where people feel that there is justice in the system and that they can begin to have faith again in their government institutions. Another aspect, of course, is tenure security. When there is, in Colombia, it's estimated there's about a 40% informality and that grows even greater in rural areas, and especially in areas that were heavily affected by the armed conflict. Informal tenure percentages are very high, 60, sometimes 70% in some areas. And so that with the lack of documentation of rights, that can create a ripe environment for people to irregularly acquire land, either through displacement or through other means. And when there is a record, it doesn't necessarily mean that an armed person or an armed group can't come in and take that land, but there is a base of evidence then for redressing or for reclaiming land. So then it can be a disincentive as well, or deterrence for accumulating land when there's obviously the legal documentation and the state backing of rights. And then I would say also land-based opportunities and restoring land-based livelihood opportunities is very, very critical for people, whether that is through, especially in creating viable licit opportunities for people to begin to restore their livelihoods, both through providing support from the government and technical assistance through means to make that more productive, as well as investments in public infrastructure, irrigation facilities. Tertiary roads are very, very important for opening up areas, making them more visible, creating state presence, and investments in education, health clinics, and also in security, so people do not feel so vulnerable.
Wonderful. Thank you for that really in-depth analysis. It seems to me that what you're really getting at there, that the key part of your program is addressing this issue of inequality, which is a driver of conflict and is largely based in land. And by addressing land issues, you can address some of these inequality issues. And if you're promoting rural development and other sorts of things, then that provides a good basis for moving into a post-conflict environment. And John, I would like to hear a little bit more from you from a very different context, from looking at Iraq.
Certainly. So as to why it is that land should be one of the first issues addressed after a conflict, certainly Anna articulated a number of those. I'll focus on the very high risk of not attending to land as one of the primary issues, and that is that land issues can become a flashpoint for a return to war. And so there's a number of ways that this can happen. We've seen over time and through a number of conflicts that once there's a ceasefire or once there's a peace accord, the shooting stopped, but the conflict is still there. The anger and the retribution and the causes are all still there. They have not really been addressed. A good peace accord will seek to address them over time. So what we often see is the fighting can shift from fighting with bullets to fighting over land. And so if that isn't addressed fairly quickly or managed in some way, that fight over land can become a flashpoint for a return to armed conflict. The other is that if as people return, as people start to do things just on their own after a conflict, if there isn't some mechanism to start to resolve some of these very hot issues that Anna mentioned, people will take it upon themselves to try to resolve these issues. And in Iraq, the Iraqi policymakers we work with there fear greatly that when the returnees go home and there's an issue there, if there isn't a state institutional presence or mechanism that is able to manage land rights issues, they're going to default to local militias. And that's a short distance from doing that to a return to armed conflict. As well, we see that the conduct of war, certainly Iraq and of course Syria are cases where this happens, where there's cleansing that goes on. There's the attempt at demographic change during the conflict. So it's ethnic or sectarian cleansing. And then when the war draws to a close, to the degree that that's successful or not, becomes a very serious flashpoint potential as people return and try to solidify that demographic change or reverse it, again, on their own. And so if these issues aren't attended to really quick after a war, again, these can be flashpoints for a return to armed conflict. And there can be a scramble for an assertion of rights. We see in northern Iraq that not only do we have the problem of the dislocatees that were that fled during the ISIL takeover, they're returning to conflict, but we're also seeing that those that were dislocated under the Saddam Hussein era in the same areas now also returning because they view this as an opportunity. So recall there was an Arabization effort, a very long, multi-decade that went on under the Hussein regime. So those that lost their land now want it back, or their descendants want it back, and they're returning and now coming into direct conflict with the returnees who were recently dislocated from these ISIL-held areas. So again, that's a flashpoint that there have been armed encounters between those two groups of returnees. And the risk is that if that isn't dealt with as a priority right away, again, that's a very quick shortcut back to a form of armed conflict. So those reasons for bringing land issues right to the fore in terms of the international and national response after the war draws to a close are again, this risk of a flashpoint or a set of flashpoints that returns us to armed conflict.
Great, thank you. So if land is a critical issue to address upfront, quickly, to avoid a flashpoint, as you put it, John, then how do we do that? What do you have advice for development practitioners on how we go about doing that, where to start? It's a very complex issue. It often takes a long time. Where do we start?
I think one of the ways to start is to not wait until the war is over. So we've seen that when wars are over and then we start to try to figure out what the issues are, try to put together a restitution effort, that takes a great deal of time and is very, very expensive. So one approach is to start while the war is still underway and work with those who are dislocated. To try to do a number of things. One is awareness raising. Do they know what their rights are? Do they know who to turn to if they go home and have a problem? So the idea is to get into the decision making of the returnee, and instead of having them default to a tribe or a militia or their armed kin, to know where to go in terms of a state or the police, et cetera, in order to start to resolve these things peacefully. We've also seen that often returnees and IDPs can spend a great deal of time dislocated. They're in camps, they're in cities, et cetera. And they do actually monitor their house and land and property. It used to be through networks or sending someone home to just see what's going on, or conversing with relatives, listening to the radio. Now, of course, they can do that with digital media. In both Iraq and Syria, we found that they just simply call their neighbor or a relative that's close to their house to walk by and see what the status is, or go in or see who's there, et cetera. So they are monitoring their housing, land, and property already. So to engage the fairly idle refugee or internally dislocated person in an effort to start to think about what evidence is needed, what do they have but don't know they have in terms of evidence, what does corroboration mean, and start to assemble and solidify this and attach that individual to an institution that is ready to go after a conflict would be a big advantage. IOM, the International Organization for Migration in Northern Iraq, has put together a very impressive community policing program. So this program attached communities and police forces together in a relationship prior to their return to ISIL retaken areas, so that when they do return, issues of problems, difficulties on the civil side are directly connected to this civilian policing effort, so that the police are right there and everybody knows each other, everybody knows what the issues are, et cetera. So the idea there is for the state institution to get to a retaken area as quickly as the returnee does. So as we see in Iraq and a number of places, returnees go home and they're there much quicker than the state does. So the state's institutional presence is delayed, often by years. And so with no one to turn to, of course, they then default to themselves. So in short, the idea would be to start before the war is over, start to work with refugees and the internally dislocated in what they're already doing to try to get them ready for return.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And I'm excited to say that it seems like Zemin has been able to join us in this conversation. Again, this is Dr. Zemin Haydes, a Senior Agricultural Policy Advisor from USAID Ethiopia, dealing with a very different country context in terms of land and conflict issues. And I know you weren't able to hear some of the first part of our conversation, but I'm hoping that you can jump right in and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been working on in Ethiopia.
Thank you so much, and sorry for the delay. There was kind of technical problem here. Can you hear me? I work here at the USAID Ethiopia mission on land policy aspects, and our current land administration to nurture development project works in different parts of the country. And one of the areas of intervention we have currently is trying to improve tenure security of pastoral communities in the lowland parts of the country. We are planning to pilot this communal land demarcation in Afar region, particularly. This region is known for almost 95 and more percent of the population are like dependent on livestock breeding, moving from one place to the other. And there was this issue of tenure security because both the federal and regional government allocates land for different purposes, including investment, and there was little level of consultation of communities. So we are trying to improve that situation by introducing land demarcation and certification for communal areas. So that's what we are doing here in Ethiopia.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. And that brings a very different dynamic to our conversation, which is one about communal land, pastoralist communities, presumably conflict over individual versus communal land rights, perhaps. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the interventions that you're actually doing within your programs. Zeman, I think we can't hear you. I think maybe your microphone is not unmuted.
Now, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. In our project tries to help pastoral communities to empower them in terms of feeling of ownership on their land. The constitution in Ethiopia provides almost the whole ownership to the government and regional states to administer on behalf of the people. So because of that, there was no really good practice of consulting people in terms of, allowing them get appropriate compensation when some kind of land expropriation happens. Because there is this assumption land belongs to the government can do anything they want at any time. So we are trying to change that attitude and helping pastoralists like protect their use rights and improve governance, empowering traditional customary institutions so that people know this institution can negotiate with government or any kind of investor coming to that area on behalf of the people. So this is a kind of new model. Initially, we had a problem in terms of convincing government officials. Now, there is good understanding from the part of government. They perceived it as a good kind of way to go ahead in the future in terms of collaborating with local communities. So currently we are doing on the ground demarcation of these communal areas and trying to strengthen community institution, customer institution, particularly in consultation with government institutions. So it's working well so far with some challenges, but we are hoping we'll get this thing done in a few months' time before this the current project, which is ending in March, is completed.
Thank you very much for that. You raised two very important issues. One, customary land rights and formalizing those. It often is quite a large challenge, and the importance of demarcation on the ground and as part of the process of formalization. And I'd like to switch the conversation back to Anna and ask, my understanding from your program is that you work very closely with the government, and I'm wondering what are the advantages? Why is that your approach? What are the advantages of working with the national level government?
Thanks, Kim. I'm actually, one of the primary reasons that I was attracted to coming on board with this program was specifically because it did work through government institutions. And what I feel the advantage of that is when you think about public service delivery, whether that's land administration, whether that's developing public infrastructure, whether that's technical assistance or extension, that's the job of the government. And then when development cooperation steps in and does things that fill public service delivery gaps, or does things for the government, what you can tend to do really is create more of a cycle of dependency on international cooperation rather than building up capacities of the government to essentially do what is their job and what they're elected or hired to do. So what we aim for really is to create a situation. You know, Colombia is a middle income country. It has strong institutions. It has strong laws. It has a very talented and educated pool of human resources. In a context like that, supporting government institutions to do efficient and effective quality public service for themselves is how you evolve out of a situation where there is a need for development cooperation support. Another reason really is related to the conflict itself, is that one of the sparks for that conflict was the absence of strong government or strong state presence, I would say, in the rural areas, and lack of investment in those rural areas, which fueled a lot of social grievances, people being sort of left behind. So by working with local governments, developing their planning capacity, working with them to mobilize resources from the national level or generate resources from there at the local level, and to be able to have a strong state presence and also improve public service delivery at the local level is very important to prevent reemergence of conflict.
Great, thank you. And you bring up a very important point, and it certainly is reflected in the conflict literature as well, that dynamic between the government and society is really important. And when services are not being delivered or when the functions of the state are not being fully carried out, that can actually spark conflict. So your point is well taken. And I heard a similar point made by John when he was talking about that when people are returning, that the state or the police need to go somewhere, perhaps to a more formal institution, in order to resolve conflicts over land, or else that can devolve into using militias or other less desirable ways of resolving land grievances. And another thing that was brought up early on in this conversation was the use of technology to get some of these land issues resolved. And John, I know that some of your research looks specifically at this issue, and it's quite intriguing how we can utilize this new technology to address some of these long-standing issues. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Certainly, I think one of the more interesting things about the use of technology in attending to housing, land, and property issues during and after war is the degree to which it's already happening. So if you got a spare moment, look up Wikimapia. So Wikimapia is this interesting thing that uses Google Maps, and it allows you to go in and draw a boundary around your property. So if you want to have some fun, look up Wikimapia Syria or Egypt. And so there, what's happening is refugees are already on their own going there and seeking to delineate their property. In other words, make a claim. You can upload photos there, you can draw a boundary there, etc. It's not official. It's pretty ad hoc. Anybody can do this, or anybody can contest it, etc. But it is interesting to see these sorts of things go on. And so, as I noted earlier, people are now able to call home and have a picture sent to them about their housing, land, and property. We found that in doing work with Syrian refugees, they often, however, don't know what the connection is between their use of digital technology and the legal aspects of housing, land, and property claims. So for example, do they know what good evidence is? Do they know that the fact that they have a selfie with themselves or their family and their house in the background and a GPS and a date stamp on it? Do they know that that's pretty good evidence that corroborates other assertions of claim? If they don't, and frequently they don't, then they can delete that off of the phone. Have they interviewed their grandmother in the corner with regard to the history of the land or property, and made that into an audio file and then uploaded that and kept that somewhere? Frequently not. They don't know that that's good evidence. So what needs to happen is the connection between what we're seeing is a very impressive literacy rate in terms of digital media use with people who are dislocated, and connect that to some of the legal notions that they will need when they're going to be pursuing issues of reclaim. So what our project looks at is how these populations, these dislocated populations, can become aware of these things, gather different forms of evidence, formal and informal, upload these into a secure platform. And then what can even go on prior to the end of the war is that this evidence for claim can be categorized. So frequently in a restitution program, as we know after war, mass claims, hundreds of thousands to millions, decisions are made about categories of claims. So to begin to categorize claims prior to the end of the war, it makes this a very quick endeavor. You can also come up with what are called evidentiary patterns by looking at massive numbers of claims. And that allows you to seek remedies very, very quickly. A big hurdle, as we know, in restitution programs is actually data entry. But again, if IDPs and refugees are uploading their evidence and other indications for claim themselves, then this skips that data entry problem. So there's enormous potential savings, both in time and money, for restitution, large-scale restitution processes to take place, if we can actually leverage the digital media literacy that refugees already have, and what they're already doing to sort of organize this a bit more.
Great, thank you. That's fascinating how new technology can be used actually as a legal basis to reclaim land. And I would like to turn to some questions that we're getting online. And one question that looks particularly interesting and difficult to answer is one about how are we learning from places where there have been some challenges to implementing land programs, and particularly looking at perhaps the role of indigenous sort of communal titling versus versus individual titling, I believe is what this question is getting at, as particularly looking at Guatemala and other cases. But I would like to open it up a little bit broader than that, and just to say, how are we learning from some failures or some places where it hasn't worked as well as it could have?
Maybe I could start off with just a few words. Very relevant question, and definitely a difficult one. I think one of the things that we've learned is to try to particularly after war, but maybe more broadly in development, try to simply replicate what works really good in the developed West, and try to kind of package that and then implement it in a different place when things are really difficult. So if we take what works in the United States, for example, we know private property works very well, and we try to do that very, in a situation that's very fluid, trying to recover from conflict. That's very difficult to do and can be counterproductive. It takes a long period of time. You may solidify claims that are illicit, that I've come across during fraud, et cetera. And so one of the big lessons that we've learned is that post-conflict situations are very, very different than stable settings. And to try to move forward with housing, land, and property rights fix or a corrective after a war by trying to insert something that is more suitable for stable settings, as opposed to doing something very quick up front and then over time progressing to something that is more usable in a stable setting is a fairly big issue. And Afghanistan and Liberia suffer from those mistakes that were made. We thought we could just go in and quickly implement private property and return of land and get things sort of very workable when institutional viability wasn't there. There was too much anger. There was too much revenge setting still in place, and it wasn't stable. And so doing something broadly and focusing on managing the mess as opposed to trying to correct and resolve every single dispute after a conflict, especially early on in a transitional justice context, is perhaps more worthwhile.
Wonderful, thank you. And I would like to, because this issue really, the core of this issue is about communal land rights, which certainly I think Zemin probably has some thoughts to add to that, because the working on issues of pastoralism is certainly linked to communal land. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts to add.
Sure, I think the point's really very relevant and very important at this point, especially when you talk about communal rights versus individual rights. Those communities who used to have strong customary institutions were able to manage for a long period of time, keeping the use right as communal rights. But after a certain period of time, that situation has been changed because of weakening traditional institutions. Some individuals were able to fence some of the plots and changing their livelihood to a kind of agropastoralism and applying some plots without really getting the consent and agreement of the communities, maybe bribing local authorities and doing all those kinds of things. This has been leading to a sort of conflict within the community themselves, like well-to-do ones against, the majority. And this has been an experience in Ethiopia. So we are trying to change that kind of situation, restoring back the traditional thinking, the customary restoration best practices, so that they can manage any kind of land allocation with the consent of the majority without really compromising the benefit and interest of the majority of people, particularly the disadvantaged one, women, disabled, or the landless youth, all those kinds of segments of society. So I think that is something we need to figure out in the future, how we can really accommodate those individual interests as well. We don't want, again, this kind of new model to lead us another kind of conflict. So those individual interests can be accommodated in the form of secondary or tertiary rights within the communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm looking at the questions online, and there are actually quite a few that are asking for, I think we have a large group of development practitioners online, and people are looking for good practices, advice, success stories. What should we be doing moving forward? What are your key pieces of advice? And I would like to use this question as a way to hear from everyone as sort of a closing remark. And what are the main takeaways that that you would like to share with other development practitioners? Anna, would you like to start?
If you like, I can start with that one. One of the key factors I think that has spurred some of the success of LRDP, at the same time being a regular challenge for us, has been to adopt what we call an integrated approach or a comprehensive approach that doesn't just go in with land interventions, say the restitution and formalization interventions, but really complements those strongly and also with information technology solutions as well. by themselves, we may be able to work with governments to get people back on their land, to get rights to their land, but unless they can have a productive and fulfilling and productive life on that land, it can lead to people just turning around and selling that land or leaving the rural areas. So we work a lot on supporting critical value chains, private-public partnerships, also working with governments to do planning and to mobilize funds and to invest in infrastructure. And a key, I think, innovation around the program has been to, rather than the traditional kind of public-private partnerships we see where USAID is investing part of the money and we've got a private sector partner and producer associations, the public in the model that we use is really the local governments, and getting the local governments critically engaged in supporting those, whether that's through committing to investments in tertiary roads, whether that's through agricultural districts, whether that's providing technical assistance to those value chains, doing supporting with land use planning, etc., but that they are part and parcel of those commitments together with the private sector, with universities as well, and with producer associations. So that's been a real model of success. In addition, I would say another is working with local governments to do compliance with restitution sentences that emerge. So we support the land restitution unit in preparing the cases and getting stronger with preparing the evidence, et cetera, for the cases. It then goes to the judicial phase. The judge issues an order for restitution, and usually it's not just land, it's a whole bunch of other things that involve livelihood opportunities, involve infrastructure. But working with the municipal governments who are ultimately responsible, but often don't see themselves necessarily as responsible from the outset, to say, you're in charge of ensuring all these institutions, whether it's education, health, land, are complying and fulfilling these restitution orders. At the same time, they need to work to get the resources to fulfill those So working with them to do that planning, to mobilize those resources, and to be able to fulfill those restitution sentences. Because oftentimes you can get to, oh, all these people have been restituted, but in practice, they really don't. They really don't have what the orders promise them. So that's been a really important part, is having municipalities and those institutions feel like they are ultimately responsible for fulfilling those.
Wonderful, thank you. Could we hear from Zemin as well? Some last words of advice to development practitioners?
Yes, my final point on this is, like, when we have any kind of land administration project, we need to do a thorough analysis and study of the situation. So it's really complex when you go to the communal areas. If you are talking conflict, land may not be the only issue that's leading to conflict. There are many things that we need to take into consideration. Understanding the situation, and again discussing with the communities and local government to come up with certain solutions that really accommodate the interests of different groups in that area. The other thing, what we are doing in Ethiopia is, by doing this land certification, we also introduce land use planning, which is the most important element of land administration. So if we introduce land use planning, we will be able to allocate land for different purposes so that people can use those resources without any problem. So sustainability issue, land use, land management are important elements of land administration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And how about you, John?
Sure. So a couple of things. One, more broadly, the very good issue that was brought up of how to handle customary law and statutory law particularly after conflict. There was a case in Mozambique and Zambia where they've experimented with a couple of things. Mozambique is an interesting example where after its war, an early version of the land law, they equated indigenous occupation with title, so that one does not prevail over the other. This effectively brings forms of indigenous claim or customary claim into statutory law. And while the lawyers didn't like that because it was quite messy, it did pursue significant civil peace and led to a dispute resolution that was sort of out of court when we had a title versus customary occupation. But by the law recognizing occupation and making it equal to title, that seemed to move forward with a lot of interesting ways to resolve conflict. So that's a positive development. I mentioned the community policing in Iraq that IOM has moving forward. That seems to be producing some positive results. So we're happy about that. One thing that practitioners might ask themselves is, after a conflict, when things are very fluid, people are moving from crisis livelihoods back to something more along the lines of a stable livelihood. What are they already doing? What's already underway that they could assist with or amplify or transfer to other areas, things that are already working? So if we take the example of Iraq and this propensity to default to the local neighborhood militia to solve your housing, land, and property rights problem, these militias are actually not ideological. They're not extremists. They're more neighborhood protection units or neighborhood self-help groups, and they're armed because there's a lot of violence around. And so the Iraqi government is moving forward with trying to involve them and involve local tribes and involve the leadership of sects as authority structures in housing, land, and property. So instead of the state trying to compete with these with regard to whose authority prevails in terms of housing, land, and property issues and laws, et cetera, it tries to involve them. So that can be a little, again, messy because you can have competing authorities, but it is right after the war where it is very fluid and messy, and they're discovering that to engage this is a more peaceful way forward that can then change over time, and so that it's solidified. So what authority structures are already there, emerging? Some of them can be nefarious, but in including them, can you actually change their character so that you're working kind of with the grain that goes on? This idea of housing, land, and property being a different sort of idea after the war and managing it in a different way in a post-war environment versus a more stable environment, East Timor had quite a success with. They were very quick to issue a number of decrees that handled very quickly a number of very problematic land and property issues after the war. You don't want to govern by decrees, however, so these decrees had an end date by which they would close themselves down when things were more peaceable and legislation caught up. So legislation is a very slow-moving thing, and after a war we need something that is much quicker. So the idea of that East Timor's new government came in with after its end of its conflict was to issue a number of very precise decrees that didn't have a great deal of time connected with it and didn't have a great deal of breadth, but they fixed very specific problems for the short term until legislation could catch up with it. And then those decrees were turned off. So realizing that it is a different fluid environment after a conflict, and thinking what is a short-term fix or something that can gain you time in order to get moving with a transitional justice period and move later toward more firmly established laws and property rights issues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Certainly, there's a lot of food for thought here. I'm going to highlight a few of the big issues that came out of this conversation. Certainly one is that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Clearly, as Zeman said, we need complex analysis that's based on what we are seeing on the ground, land use planning, things like that. We can't ignore the economic piece. When we're dealing with land in post-conflict situations, economic opportunities are key. Engaging government institutions as part of the process, again, critical. That we should be thinking about interventions earlier rather than later, even during a conflict situation, and that we need to be perhaps not afraid of some of the messy solutions, things like short-term legislative fixes, short-term fixes before the longer-term legislative or legal fixes can be put in place. So not shying away from the complexity issues. And to close out, if you are interested, thank you everyone who has joined. There are additional resources available at LandLinks. There are reports and stories available. The links to the LandLinks website. There's a briefer on land in conflict. USAID also has a land and conflict toolkit, which is in the process of being updated. But that's another great resource. So after this webinar, you'll be getting an email pointing you towards additional resources. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all of the panelists. And I certainly have learned a lot from this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.